One of the first questions before we get into your book is that you make it clear that dissent is not tolerated at the academies, let alone a broad worldview. Yet you excoriate a lot of both, not just the military, but the institutions, yet you're still part of the faculty. How do those two coincide where you would think that especially somebody tearing down at the mores or the norms of the place would still find a home there?
The military, Richard, is a critical institution in American society, but over the past century, especially over the past 50 to 75 years, a lot of the military has begun to focus on loyalty over almost all other values, including truth. One of the reasons that I'm willing to speak up, and that some others are willing to speak up also, is that I think we feel an obligation to do it despite being in precarious positions throughout our careers. And this is necessary, and this is part of our constitutional obligations to speak up when necessary to point out some of the things that we consider to be difficulties with the military. My particular focus has been on the military and war over the past 75 years, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, none of which have been successful, and all of which have come at a tremendous cost to our military and to our country.
With the focus in law as you do, I'm curious, just in the Trump years, if you've noticed a concern among military leadership. I mean, given, for example, what happened to Navy SEAL Gallagher and the attempt to discipline within the ranks, and then basically the executive branch saying never mind, and not even allowing even post-fact after the trial to have even any internal discipline. We've seen countless generals being shown the door by this president, and even condemning military brass as idiots, etc. Has there been a changing, at least from the perspective of a lot of military superiors, that, wait a minute, what we thought we were getting to where we are now with this particular administration, something very different?
One of my perspectives is that the military is separate from civilian society. And when that has occurred over the course of history, our military and our country have had difficulties. Over the past 75 years, the military has consciously made a decision to separate from American society, and this has been ingrained in law because of several cases in the 1970s and 80s. In regard to cases in the military justice system, one of the reasons that we sometimes wonder about what's happening is that it's a very obscure system. In fact, the military has its own penal system, its own selection of laws from which it chooses to decide what to do with soldiers or officers over a period of time. That kind of separation from society, where the mores of civilian society as well as the laws in civilian society that we've come to expect do not exist in the military any longer. Let me give you just a couple examples. In a couple of the cases that I mentioned from the 70s and 80s, the military went to the Supreme Court and asked permission, and the Supreme Court granted it, to withdraw from military officers and soldiers the right to speak freely and the right to practice their religion as they feel necessary. The Supreme Court agreed with the generals that this was for good order and discipline, but in the process, military personnel have lost the opportunity to speak up because they've lost the right to speak up when they feel that something should be said. Because of that, the generals, whether it's today or in the past, are not speaking up about whether they think war should be started or whether wars should be stopped. And as a result of that, it's very difficult because, as I said, the military has become a separate society for us to know what is really necessary in regard to war, whether they should be started and when they should be stopped.
To that end, and you spend a good amount in your book talking about the pervasive sexual assaults that have happened at not just West Point, but all the military academies. To that end, have you seen in your time there a change? I know that I've spoken to commandants that have made it a major issue, at least publicly addressing all the students. And we have seen, I've talked to advocates of victims of abuse, that there have been, they believe, some tangible changes that have happened on the ground level at the academies. Have you seen that yourself?
What we can report is based on studies from the Pentagon and the Department of Justice. Over the past few years, the Pentagon has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in trying to combat sexual assault in the military, but it cannot come below 2,000 or up to 20,000 sexual assaults sometimes each year in the military. It just simply can't go below that particular number, it seems. With regard to the military academies, those studies show, when they're analyzed, that it appears that a woman cadet at a military academy stands a much higher risk of being sexually assaulted, up to 5 times, than students at colleges throughout the United States. The problem is not just with the military academies, which have made an effort to try to stop sexual assault, but rather the problem is with the hierarchical structure of the military. It's possible, and this is what's tremendously worrisome, that in a hierarchical society in a modern age, that there might not be a floor to violence. That is to say, we might be, despite as much as we want to stop violence, when there is a hierarchical society or a structured system when people cannot speak up, a way that we cannot stop the violence that exists. And therefore, I've advocated that the hierarchical system must be adjusted. The military must be reformed to make it a flatter institution so that there are opportunities for people to speak up, and so that one person doesn't have absolute control over the lives of all other people beneath her or him.
Tim, I'm curious, though, in context of when you began this project and now in context of this particular president, if any of the views you believe from military leadership may have changed, because we've seen a lot of pushback. I'm not just talking about General Mattis, Kelly, McMaster's, et cetera, those who have disagreed with the president and been shown the door, but also a lot of other brass that have said, you know, this administration goes too far, both in terms of condemning allies, condemning, for example, diplomacy instead of just the end of a gun, also the ability that there shouldn't be consequences for war crimes. We've seen military leadership push back in a more progressive way than you'll see, than certainly more of a militaristic way that this administration does. Have you seen something different in the last couple of years in particular than you saw in the decades or so before then?
I'm not sure that I see anything different, and it seems that the military generals have not been willing to speak up over the years. In fact, can we think of any particular general in the last 75 years in regard to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan who has spoken up and said, I believe a war should not be started, or that we should withdraw from a particular conflict or a war? It was instructive when the Army Chief of Staff was Harold Johnson, General Harold Johnson, in 1964 to 1968. At those times, Johnson and other generals and many others in the military and in the civilian leadership knew that the war in Vietnam could not be won, but they remained silent. It was only after the war was over and America had not succeeded in Vietnam that General Johnson spoke up. And he said he wanted to go to the White House and tell President Lyndon Johnson that the war could not be won, and give him his 4 stars and leave and tell the public the truth about the war in Vietnam. He did not do that. After his career in the military, he did speak up, and he said that, but his famous line was, "I'll go to my grave with that lapse in moral courage." And that's something that I've argued about, and I've observed not only in recent years, but also over the decades and in the past 75 years in regard to wars and conflicts. Military generals are simply unwilling to speak up to tell what they believe. And to a lesser extent, the officers below them are unwilling to speak up also. I realize that this challenges the hierarchical system of the military, but if we're not going to speak up when wars are wrong, then we're not fulfilling our constitutional obligation. The most obvious thing to say would be that I don't think a war can be won, and that would save a lot more soldiers than remaining silent and allowing the wars to continue where we have not succeeded in those 75 years in those 4 major wars.
But Tim, how would that work if a military can use discretionary judgment as to when and when not to conduct military campaigns. Isn't by nature that's the very reason in part we hire elected officials to make the decisions, to go ahead and then for us to have the windows in time to go back to the ballot box if we don't agree with the war, to then vote with our feet, if you will. Do we really want to leave that to the military to make up their own distinctions when it is and isn't worth the fight?
Mine is exactly the opposite argument. We do not want to leave the generals that decision. But what has happened, because the generals and the military have separated themselves from civilian society, we don't know what's happening in the military, and as a result, we have to rely on information that comes from the military for our information about the wars. In fact, I would argue that we have to put more power in the hands of Congress, or at least Congress must assume their power. They have the right to control the military in all respects. In regard to the Constitution's requirements for what Congress may or may not do, probably about a third of Congress's authority deals with controlling the military. The Congress has the right to step up, and it should, and the President certainly has the right to control the military. This is not an argument at all that the military should control whether we start wars or end wars or what we do in wars, but it is an argument that when the military is separate from American society, as it is today and has been for a generation or more, the generals have an obligation to tell us the truth. They do not have the option under their constitutional obligations to remain silent when they believe that wars should not be fought or wars should not be won. Otherwise, if they're not telling us, as was the case in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, then we're not going to know. And as a result, we've been in almost continuous war for those 75 years. Just think of the war in Afghanistan, now more than 18 years long, and we see just in the last couple months in the Afghanistan papers that almost every single person in the military and the civilian leadership said we did not have a plan to win the Afghanistan war. One general even said we didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were doing.
My last question, apropos of that, is this president has said, basically, the military, they're with me. To that end, and nothing's beyond the realm here, as we've seen the last 3 years. Let's say in this fall, in November, the election doesn't go the president's way, but he doesn't necessarily recognize the results of the election. What's your perspective from the ground level you've had if he decides that he's going to enlist the military in an effort to stay in office? While that would sound like I needed a tin hat to even come up with such a theory before, I don't think it's beyond the realm here. To that end, what do you think would happen?
The military has an obligation, and I think all officers take the obligation seriously, not to follow unlawful orders. The military generals, and you were talking about discretion, Richard, have the responsibility to refuse an unlawful order, whether it's from the president or from anybody else in the chain of command. I have full confidence that the military would indeed refuse to carry out a lawful order, and if the election went one way or another, the military generals would have to make a decision. No matter what, there is discretion to some extent. Generals and military officers are not robots, and they have to make decisions sometimes. I'm arguing, of course, that they should be willing to speak up when they know wars should not be started or should be abandoned. And I think I have confidence in them that they have the knowledge and they have the fortitude, I hope, to understand that they have to follow all lawful orders. And an election, of course, is something that's based on the Constitution. And as every officer knows, the Constitution is superior, is supreme to whatever a civilian leader says and to whatever a military leader says. And we should get back to the bedrock. And if we adhere to the Constitution and the rule of law, then I think we're on the right track and we can continue to maintain our democracy and not have it erode before us.
Well, as we know, Tim, with some legitimate questions about checks and balances and separations of powers we've learned in the last few months, it is not a question beyond the pale. Again, the book, The Cost of Loyalty. Tim Bakken, thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate your inviting me.